Macrae.
Just first of all, I was very fortunate to be going through my undergraduate and the beginnings of my graduate education at the time when sports science was taking off around the world. And sports science was really a mesh between physical education on one side and medicine on the other, and bridging the gap that existed between the two. Medicine is really clinically oriented. It's focused on fixing people when they're broken. Physical education was about helping people be skilled physically, perhaps for a sport or in play, and to develop lifelong skills. And sports science was bringing the science of physiology, anatomy, biochemistry, nutrition, psychology, etc., biomechanics, together with what the physical educators were doing. And that led me then into my PhD work, which was really focused on a macronutrient, carbohydrate, a fragment of that called lactate, and what happened to it during exercise. And when I began my academic career, I pursued really nutrition was one side of what I did academically, looking at how to optimize nutrition specifically for sub-elite or elite athletes or people who play team sports. I was also very interested in the intersection of technology with sport, specific sports. So to what extent could technology not only inform the athlete, but coaches as well? And was it a viable technology? That is, could it drive the sport forward in terms of its development? And then I'd say at the third level was cognition or neuroscience / mental performance. Were there ways in which we could, first of all, measure the extent to which the brain was contributing to performance? And were we able then to manipulate that in order to get more out of the individual? So I would say those would have been the three focal areas of my academic research. Master's work at Texas, one of my main focus areas was on motor control or neuroscience, so I'd always had that interest. I'd worked for another company in the mid-2000s, so around 2011, 2012, 2013. We were working with special operations at Fort Bragg, measuring electrical activity in the brain under different kinds of stress, with the intention of developing practical applications for these operators when they were in a high stress environment. How would they manage that stress? Could we train the brain to perform well under those conditions of sleep deprivation, high stress? And what we know historically with gamers was high sugar intakes and very high caffeine intakes in these individuals. And the problem with very high sugar loads over time, so drinking sodas, for example, or drinking sports drinks, which are extremely high in sugar, is that sugar is very toxic at high levels. There's a reason we only have a small amount in our blood, and that we store it in our liver and muscle. We do not tolerate very high levels well. And so these very high sugar levels are neurotoxic. They damage brain cells. So that compromises performance over time. It's also metabolically very unhealthy. And so we were looking at fuels, which could be alternatives, right? So can we reduce the amount of caffeine that's being consumed? What can we substitute for this high sugar load that's not only neurotoxic, but it gets consumed very rapidly when you provide it? I mean, you get these ups and downs in energy supply. I take a high sugar load, and generally within about an hour to an hour and a quarter later, I need another one because I've used it so quickly. So we were looking at alternatives, and what we found was that the most stable way to provide the energy for the brain was to try and reduce, I would call it added sugars in the diet. How can we reduce added sugars yet still supply the brain adequately with energy? And the best way to do that was actually by adapting to a low carbohydrate diet, and particularly by restricting added sugars. And if you allow enough time for that adaptation to occur in the body, you get a very, very sustained energy release. You don't get the big ups and downs that also affect mood, by the way, and affect your sleep behavior when you have that. And so that's what we landed on. That is also why Fit Gamer promotes a low carbohydrate, low added sugar, low refined food or processed food diet in order to optimize not only metabolic health, but specifically cognitive performance. The brain is a massive energy consumer. Most people don't realize the extent to which the brain consumes energy. And if you look at the biggest challenge in cognitive, what I would call cognitive sports, esports, or gaming, it's really burnout. It's this inability to play beyond a certain point. You know, many of the athletes we were working with were burnt out by 20 or 21 years of age. You don't see that in traditional sport. So we were trying to understand at a cognitive level or at a mental level, first of all, the demands on gamers, but also knowing that physically it's also a very challenging sport. Whereas regular sport is primarily driven by activation of large muscle groups, esports or gaming is fine motor actions, up to 300 unique actions per minute, either on a game controller or keyboard or mouse, depending on the activity. And that requires a huge amount of cognitive demand. It's not only the game itself that drives challenges on the individual, but it's those very fine motor skills that actually have to be initiated in the brain itself and can't be driven by the spinal cord. And that requires a massive amount of energy and a very, very high demand. So I would say those are the two distinct differences. Is at a very cognitive level, it's not surprising that we see burnout occurring at a young age in these individuals if they're not paying attention to what we call the 5 pillars of health. And so a lot of the fatigue we experience is not only driven by depletion of energy, but also destruction of the fiber itself or the individual fibers. And during that time, the brain is monitoring what's going on. You know, there are sensory systems that are sending signals back to the brain. And the brain will say, there's less energy than I think you should have in order to continue doing this task. I mean, if you look at marathon running, for example, it's generally 2 hours or 2.5 hours into the event for the average person where they start running at a slower pace. Well, why is that? generally they have plenty of capacity to provide energy, but the brain is sensing all kinds of inputs that are saying, I am not going to let you keep going anymore because you're going to harm yourself if you do. Now flip that around, and it's almost the opposite in gaming or esports. When you are scrimming or playing a game that lasts 20 to 25 minutes, your brain is fatiguing on the front end. It's not 2 hours later. You're going to fatigue early on in the game because of the high demands of the game. But each time an action potential is generated and you're playing or you're scrimming or playing a competitive event, think about the number of action potentials that you are generating in order to send the signals to make rapid decisions, to perform the fine motor skills, using your thumbs on the controller or mousing or keyboarding, and doing that over a 20-minute time period. It's a huge amount of energy that gets consumed. And nerve cells get damaged as well under high usage. As a muscle cell gets damaged, so too does a nerve cell. And that has to be repaired. When you look at what we've built at Fit Gamer with the 5 pillars and the ability on a day-to-day basis just to track where you are, to be aware of how you're doing in each of those spaces, I haven't seen anything yet that comprehensively does each of those things in one place.
Well played.